Most Americans are very familiar with the early English presence in the eastern United States at places like Roanoke Colony, Jamestown, the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. From second, third grade in our history books, that's what we learned about American history.
Suddenly, they disappeared without a trace. There were 115 males, females, and children. There are no graves or bodies. There is only one word engraved into the trunk of a tree, the Croatoan.
Leave a secret token, as he called it, behind, and this seemed to be the answer. Here was Croatoan carved.
On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gives birth to her daughter, Virginia, the first English child born in North America.
Over the course of several centuries, the disappearance of the Roanoke colony was the most unsolved enigma in the United States of America.
Well, that's right. The leaders of this team say what they've found is very exciting and very convincing.
However, in the year 2025, researchers have finally deciphered the code, and the findings that they discovered are not just stunning, but also terrifying. The disappearance of, under the scorching heat of the Atlantic sun in the summer of 1587, 3 English ships were able to navigate their way through the shallows and anchor off the coast of Roanoke Island, an uninhabited spit of land that is situated along the rocky coastline of the region that is now known as North Carolina. There were 115 individuals, including men, women, and children, who embarked on the journey to the New World. These individuals did not come to the New World as explorers, but rather as dreamers, each bearing the fragile hope of a fresh start. Their attempt was not the first one made. 2 earlier attempts by the English had already been unsuccessful, and they were characterized by violence, inadequate supplies, and internal strife. But this group, which was led by John White, who was both friendly and practical, was not like the others. The families had been brought over by them. They had always intended to remain in place. There was also a newborn baby, which was a representation of that hope. The first English kid to be born on American soil was Virginia Dare, who was John White's granddaughter once she was born. Not only was her birth hailed as a source of joy for her family, but it was also honored as a political declaration that England could establish its roots here. Under the protection of a canopy of pine and oak trees, the immigrants labored ceaselessly to construct a simple wooden fort, produce crops, and forge delicate connections with the indigenous peoples of the area. They persevered despite the nature of the area, which was wild, gorgeous, and punishing. Subsequently, practically immediately after they had landed, White was compelled to go back to England in order to acquire additional supplies. A journey that he anticipated would take no more than a few months to complete. Nevertheless, Europe was ablaze. A deadly confrontation was taking place between England and Spain at the time. Additionally, Queen Elizabeth I had ordered every ship that was available to be dedicated to the battle against the Spanish Armada. White remained adrift for 3 laborious years, unable to do anything but watch the calendar tick by while pondering the possibility of what was taking place on the other side of the water. It was in August of 1590 when he eventually made his way back to Roanoke, and the silence was completely oppressive. A spooky calm prevailed in the harbor. The fort was in the same condition that he had left it in. Unbroken gates, upright palisades, and unharmed structures are all present. However, there was no longer any life. Not a single person managed to stir. There was no sound of laughter, footfall, or smoke coming from the fireplaces. There was a heavy feeling in the air, as if the island itself was aware of what had occurred and chose not to speak about it. There was no evidence of violence, no blood, no things that were scattered, no graves that had been recently dug, and no bones that had been picked clean by time. The sole indication of what happened to the settlers was a carving in the wood, Croatoan written on the entrance post of the fort, as well as the initials CRO written on a neighboring tree in their incomplete form. White felt his heart pounding. This word, Croatoan, was the name of an island that was located nearby and was made up of a welcoming indigenous tribe. In the event that they needed to relocate in an emergency, the code that was agreed upon was to cut out their destination. Both the cross and the emblem of distress were absent. He speculated that they might have relocated on their own volition. Maybe they were in a safe place. On the other hand, fate did not allow him to find out. During the time that White was getting ready to set sail for Croatoan, a strong storm settled in. The anchor of his ship had broken. There was a decrease in supplies. The morale of the crew completely crumbled. It was with a heavy heart that White made his way back to England. and he would never come back again. His journal continues to be one of the few first-hand descriptions of that event that continues to exist to this day. His words shake with perplexity and have a strong sense of hopelessness. The thing that frightened him was not what he actually saw. His failure to do so was the issue. Additionally, as a result of this, a whole colony, which was a piece of England that had been transplanted to the New World, disappeared without a trace. Clues that are buried in dead ends. Throughout the years that followed, the fate of Roanoke became a mystery that no historian could unravel, and no conspiracy theorist could resist the urge to speculate on it. Jamestown, which was located further to the north, was the location where New English settlers first began to generate reports. They told of weird meetings, tribes with members who spoke broken English and claimed to descend from white ancestors, and what they said was that they had encountered. Some had gray eyes, lighter hair, and other characteristics that were not prevalent among the native nations. In addition, there were rumors that crude maps depicted settlements located inland that had architecture designed in the English manner, structures that are arranged in a linear fashion, as if they were directed by a Western hand. Despite this, nothing was ever confirmed. Each and every lead produced ash. In the course of time, more ominous hypotheses emerged. A number of people were under the impression that the colonists had been murdered by the local tribes following a diplomatic failure. They were driven to cannibalism or madness by a number of factors, including internal warfare, famine, or harsh winters, according to others. There were a few theorists that put the finger at the Spanish, who were known to cruise the Atlantic seaboard and eliminate competing settlements in stealth. Then followed the tales of curses, of hallowed burial grounds being disturbed, and of the land itself rejecting the alien inhabitants as if it were a body-fighting infection. However, excavations and investigations continued even though there were no solutions to be found. The island and the areas that surround it were thoroughly investigated by archaeologists. Beads, fragments of pottery, and weapons that had rusted were among the artifacts that they discovered. It is possible that these items did not belong to the colonists. The distinction between fact and myth was as thin as that of paper.
As the Dare Stone, so called because the message on the rock is from Eleanor White Dare.
A group of boulders known as the Dare Stones were discovered in 1937. These rocks were allegedly engraved with messages from Eleanor Dare, Virginia's mother. The first stone revealed that Eleanor had suffered from illness, death, and grief. The narrative enthralled the entire population, and subsequent stones were an excessive number. In the end, academics marked most of them, if not all of them, as fakes. Disillusionment once again triumphed over hope in this episode. Nevertheless, there was something about the departure of the Roanoke colony that refused to die. It lingered in the mentality of the American people. It was a blank canvas with just enough truth to stimulate speculation and just enough absence to maintain mythology. It was a perfect illustration of neither. As the centuries passed, technological advancements were made, DNA research was proposed, and ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR scans were used to search the shoreline of the Carolinian region. However, the enigma was not resolved in any way. The disappearance of an entire town into the woods occurred in waves, and in their place, there are mysteries. The secret that was hidden on the map. Like many other significant historical discoveries, it started with a relatively insignificant thing. In the year 2012, an inquisitive researcher working at the British Museum was carefully analyzing a watercolor map from the 16th century that was titled La Virginia Pars. This map was created by the English artist and explorer John White. A fragile and sun-faded map, the map had been a subject of academic curiosity for a considerable amount of time. On the other hand, the researcher noticed something strange on that particular day. Underneath a piece of paper, there was a peculiarity that was scarcely discernible unless you already knew just where to look. Through the use of backlighting, an age-old method for identifying underdrawings and erasures, they were able to recognize it. The faint but distinct form of a square-shaped fort that had been meticulously etched beneath the surface. The symbol was drawn in invisible ink, or probably an iron gall composition that had gradually faded over the course of several centuries. It was concealed behind a patch that was located close to the junction of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers. The fact that the marking was hidden from view was not the only thing that made this discovery so remarkable. The fact that it was located exactly 50 miles west of Roanoke Island was also a significant factor. those distances were not chosen at random. Before John White went back to England in 1587, he had written a mysterious letter in his own journals, and this note corresponded with the one shown here. According to the information that White documented in it, the Roanoke colonists, who would subsequently disappear without a trace, had planned to advance 50 miles into the Maine. The sentence, which had been disregarded for a considerable amount of time, or obscured by the enigma of the word Croatoan, which was carved into a tree, suddenly found new significance. How did White manage to conceal this fort? There was a lot of speculation among historians. A number of people were under the impression that he had the intention of shielding the site of the colony from Spanish spies, who were vigorously searching the Americas in order to undermine English settlements. Some others speculated that White himself never came back because he was afraid of what he might discover, whether it was failure, disease, or something even more devastating. The map, which appeared to be a harmless artifact, had turned into a cipher for the mystery of the first colony to disappear from the United States. The discovery sparked excitement among the archaeological community. Almost immediately after that, the First Colony Foundation, which is situated in North Carolina and is committed to unraveling the enigma of Roanoke, made the decision to take action. They started an investigation into this new location, which was a region along the Albemarle Sound in Bertie County, North Carolina. Nick Luchetti, a well-known archaeologist, was in charge of the inquiry. It was not long before this intriguing location was given a new moniker that was both ominous and hopeful: Site X. Site X and the Ghosts of Bertie. The excavation at Site X started with a great deal of expectation, but not without some degree of skepticism. The landscape, which was densely covered with pine forest and underbrush that was tangled, did not resemble the concept of an English fort that is commonly associated with it. And as the excavation continued, the team discovered that there were no palisade walls, trenches, barracks, or anything else that suggested the presence of a fort. However, something later on, the dirt started to reveal secrets just beyond the bounds of a Native American hamlet that had been abandoned and was known as Metacum. Pieces of English pottery that were clearly dated to the late 1500s were discovered when they were unearthed deep beneath centuries of dirt. These were not goods that were used for trade or ceremonies. Rather, they were practical. Containers such as bowls, storage jars, and cooking pots, many of which were glazed with the distinctive greenish hue that is characteristic of Surrey, Hampshire goods from medieval England. In addition, there was one particular aspect that stuck out more than any other. Pipes made of clay were not present. In the absence of this, a lot was said. Clay tobacco pipes were a popular item among the residents of Jamestown, which was established in 1607. These pipes were frequently found in the garbage dumps of the colonists. Nevertheless, the Roanoke colonists were there before that trend began. In this case, their absence was not an oversight. Rather, it was a timestamp. It was a groundbreaking finding that denoted something. The pottery not only hinted to the existence of the English, but it also suggested that they settled there. They were not merely passing through or wandering around aimlessly. It was at least for a period of time that someone had lived here, cooked here, stored food here, and established here. Ground-penetrating radar was utilized by the team in order to conduct a survey of the surrounding area as the level of interest in the region increased. During this time, a second promising spot was discovered, which was only 2 miles distant and would subsequently be referred to as Site Y. Once again, the soil provided a witness that was silent but profound. This time around, the artifacts covered a wider range of topics. There are fragments of European ceramics from several places, which suggests that there is a mixture of cultural roots involved. This presented a novel prospect, one that had been considered in such a comprehensive manner in the past, very infrequently. The thoughts of the researchers started to form a scenario as they continued their work. Not a single colony was lost in this story. Rather, it was a story of dispersal, an attempt that is both desperate and intelligent to integrate, adapt, and endure in the hard and unknown terrain. It is possible that some of them have assimilated with the indigenous tribes, such as the Croatian. There is a possibility that some individuals traveled farther inland in order to construct impromptu communities in the shadows, potentially with the protection of allies or native leaders who were sympathetic to their cause. Site X and Site Y, which were separated by a little piece of forest and 4 centuries of time, started muttering about a story that had been lost to the records of the colonial era. The narrative is not one of failure, but rather of fragmentation. The transition, not the disappearance, is the focus here. And as they dug further, it became increasingly apparent that Roanoke's departure was not a single event in history, but rather a patchwork of decisions, survival, and quiet endurance. There is another side of the story, which is the Hatteras Dig. A more subdued but no less interesting excavation was taking place almost 200 miles to the southeast on the windswept and salt-sprayed dunes of Hatteras Island. This excavation was taking place at the same time that Site X continued to dominate the news with its tantalizing hints and scholarly disputes surrounding it. There were always rumors that this island, which was formerly known as Croatoan, had a different destiny in store for the colonists who had gone missing. And at this very moment, those rumors were being discovered in the most concrete way that was conceivable. Mark Horton, a British archaeologist, was the driving force behind this dig. He collaborated with the Croatoan Archaeological Society, a local group that was managed by Scott Dawson, a native of the island. The finds at Hatteras provided a story of assimilation, in contrast to the artifacts that were found at Site X, which offered hints of relocation. In the midst of the wind-blown dunes and beneath the layers of shifting coastal soil, they discovered obvious indications associated with the existence of the English. The most remarkable item was a slate writing tablet that still had the faint scratches of English letters on it. Other items were a rusted rapier hilt and gun pieces that had corroded. These relics were not chosen at random. They were left behind by individuals who were obviously residing on the island, and not just passing through. They were thoughtful, human, and purposeful. Perhaps even more intriguing was the oral heritage of the island, which had been handed down from generation to generation among the Lumbee and other indigenous people. White settlers were said to have joined forces with the indigenous Croatoan people, forming families, building lives, and adjusting to their new home, according to these accounts, which have been disregarded by the mainstream academic community for a long time as either myth or romanticism. All along, those tales had remained nothing more than tales until this point. The artifacts, on the other hand, conveyed a story that echoed those voices from the past, providing weight to something that had been rejected as folklore for a significantly long time. These discoveries were meticulously chronicled in the book that Scott Dawson will publish in 2020 titled The Lost Colony and Hatteras Island. What he had to say was thought-provoking. It is not true that the colony left. It broke apart. Some may have traveled inland in the direction of Site X, but others, possibly more than previously anticipated, assimilated with the indigenous populations of Croatoan itself. They were safe and sound. They were merely concealing themselves in plain sight, using the indifference of history as a disguise. This gave rise to a notion that was even more audacious. Could it be that both of these tales, Site X and Hatteras, were accurate? Is it possible that the lost colony did not perish, but rather developed? A study of the lost and the lost. The researchers were aware that they needed to go beyond shovels and maps in order to investigate this notion in depth. The field of archaeology was no longer in isolation. In the span of several centuries, it was a forensic inquiry. Therefore, the subsequent stage started, using cutting-edge technology to solve mysteries. By employing ground-penetrating radar, the researchers were able to identify irregularities beneath the surface of the Earth without causing any disruption to the delicate landscape. Then, LiDAR, a technology that extracts vegetation from computer scans in order to uncover old buildings and changes in the terrain that have been concealed for a very long period, came into existence. These instruments unearthed patterns, post holes, fence lines, and historic hearths that indicated the presence of long-term settlement activity in regions that were previously believed to be devoid of human habitation. The artifacts themselves, however, provided the most disturbing insights into the situation. Scatterings of pottery, tools, and fragments were analyzed by researchers from sites X, Y, and Hatteras in the hopes of identifying linkages or discrepancies between the three locations. Because of what they discovered, the timeline was turned upside down. In contrast to the artifacts that were found in Jamestown or Plymouth, which included clay tobacco pipes, pottery made after 1600, and distinctive European products, none of these markers were found at the sites that were linked with Roanoke. At the same time, the elements were compatible with an English presence that existed prior to the year 1600, which is precisely when the Roanoke settlers would have vanished. One thing was meant by this. These were not only remnants of colonial movement that occurred later. These were the colonists of Roanoke who were actually present. DNA analysis was the next step, which was a bombshell. Researchers started discovering markers that were consistent with Western European heritage, that were buried deep inside the genetic code of local indigenous tribes. These markers dated back hundreds of years. It was not the consequence of Europeans mixing with one another later on. Rather, it was something much older, something that coincided with the history of 1587 in a surprisingly good way. It was at that moment that the researchers shared their findings, initially in a low voice, but later with a growing sense of realization. This was a terrifying experience. All of the things that we believed we knew about early American history, such as Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, and the Mayflower mythology, might not even be the beginning at all if the implications are accurate. It is possible that the true first chapter was written by a group of colonists who had already been reported dead, but they had not actually died yet. They lived, they adapted, and eventually they fell out of existence, leaving no trace behind. A new discussion seems to emerge from the red dirt of North Carolina with each new discovery that was made. Skeptics and believers were pitted against one another. It was no longer merely a historical conundrum. Rather, the mystery of the lost colony had evolved into a battleground for ideological conflict. On one side were those who believed the facts and were sure that it told a story that made sense. On the other hand, there were many who were skeptical, academics and scientists who viewed the results not as revelations, but rather as mysteries. An experienced archaeologist by the name of Dr. Charles Ewan was one of the most outspoken commentators. It was his warning that the chase had become less about objective finding and more about vindicating long-held views that he accused the researchers of having confirmation bias. According to what he publicly stated in an interview in 2019, they are attempting to prove a theory. It is not possible to disprove it because doing so would be harmful to scientific research. After that, there was Scott Dawson, a native Croatoan who was also a historian. His family had been residing on Hatteras Island for many generations by that point. It had always been clear to him what the correct response was. There was a successful integration of the colonists with the Croatoan tribe. In order to provide evidence in support of this theory, there were oral histories, language commonalities, and even genetic hints. As he demanded, they did not travel further inland into the enemy country. Rather, they headed to Croatoan. Dawson contended that Site X was not only excessively remote, as it was located more than 50 miles away from Roanoke Island, but it was also surrounded by people that the colonists had previously been hostile towards. A suicide attempt would have been made. On the other hand, unanimity was difficult to come by within the very organization that was leading the search, which was the First Colony Foundation itself. In one camp, the split colony idea was advocated. According to this theory, the settlers split off, with some of them seeking safety with friendly tribes along the coast, while others went inland where they settled. Additionally, there was a school of thought that completely rejected the inland theory, stating that any European artifacts discovered in that region could have been the result of earlier exploring expeditions, possibly even a reconnaissance team that was dispatched ahead of the main 1587 squad. The artifacts, European silver rings, English pottery from the 16th century, provided a vague but ambiguous narrative. But as time went on, technology altered the rules. Drone mapping, DNA sequencing, ground-penetrating radar, and enhanced radiocarbon dating started to uncover unburied secrets. Then 2025 arrived. A tiny excavation site near the Chowan River revealed a silent discovery: one burial. There were no grave gifts or opulence in the Christian burial, which faced east, only bones. DNA, however, proved she was European and a woman. This came before Jamestown's growth and disqualified the all-male Roanoke expedition. She had lived and died there, not merely gone through. It implied that others had as well. The colony that was lost had not only disappeared, they were still alive, modified, Some probably joined the Croatoan people after fleeing southeast to Hatteras Island. Others moved inland in search of independence, escape, or just a chance to survive. Their disappearance was simple, human, and desperate. It was not theatrical. The colony had suffered from malnutrition, sickness, drought, and the gradual deterioration of trust. They broke under strain. A few ran away to the sea, a few to the trees. From the records, everything faded. Written in fading ink, Roanoke is a parable as well as a mystery, a neglected narrative of bravery, survival, and cultural entanglement in the history of American origins. There are no monuments to their memory. There is just one word left: Croatoan. What oral narratives have been trying to tell all along was ultimately confirmed by science in 2025. In all honesty, they were not lost at all. Right now, we have stopped listening. More than a colony was what we came dangerously close to losing. The ability to remember, the capacity to care, and the ability to connect the dots between the footprints that had disappeared and the people who had produced them were all necessary. For the simple reason that if the first Americans to disappear could be erased with such ease, then who else have we forgotten? That is the legacy that Roanoke has left behind. The disappearance itself is not the issue. Rather, the ease with which history can let go of the past. Imagine that the colonists had never been lost and were simply waiting to be discovered. In the comments section, please share your ideas. We appreciate you taking the time to view this video with us, and we hope to see you in the next one.